Any of that opinion say aye?
Aye.
Contrary, no. Ayes have it.
I beg to move that this House do now adjourn.
The question is that this House do now adjourn. Mr Alistair Carmichael.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. Having seen the House run through business at such a blistering pace, I think we can now all settle back and enjoy the next 4 hours and 6 minutes. As I beg to move that the House has considered the matter of the Groceries Code Adjudicator. I assure the House that it's some years now since I made my living by speaking for 6-minute units in the legal profession, so we may manage to knock off the odd 6 minutes here or there. I would remind the House of my entry in the Register of Members' Interests. Yesterday, we were all here in rather greater numbers, dealing with a wider debate on agriculture. I spoke then about the importance of food manufacture and food processing to the local economy in the Northern Isles, and today we paint on a somewhat broader canvas with issues of wider concern. What is important for the agricultural industries throughout the United Kingdom, however, is always going to be important for us in the Northern Isles as well, though. In recent years, farmers in my constituency and elsewhere have found themselves caught in a pincer. They have seen their input costs, in particular the costs of things such as fuel and fertiliser, rise sharply, while the price that they were able to get for their produce at the farm gate has continued to be depressed by the operation of the market in which they are often required to operate. Farmers, to put it bluntly, have found themselves squeezed in the middle. I think it's worth reminding ourselves, Mr Deputy Speaker, of how we came to this point. The genesis of the Groceries Code Adjudicator came from an inquiry by what was then the Competition Commission, now I would guess the Competition Markets Authority, which in itself took many, many years of pressure actually to get held. That report led to the creation of the Groceries Supply Chain Code, and that in turn was followed by the Groceries Code Adjudicator Act in 2013. It was a long and slow and painful process to get even to that. I remember the conversations that I had with my colleagues in 2013 as a minister in the coalition government about how that would operate, whether it would be sufficient. I think we all knew that at some point or another we would need to revisit this, but it was certainly the case that we were pragmatic about it and we took the view that what we were getting in 2013 was better than nothing.
On that point?
Of course.
Mr Deputy, can I commend the Honourable Gentleman for Orkney and Shetland for bringing this forward? This is a massive issue which affects us all. Hailing from a farming constituency, I have a deep and intricate interest in the defence of farmers' price and income. My real fear is that the harder farmers struggle to eke out their pay, the less likely future generations are going to want to be isolated and then to work night and day for less than a minimum wage. So does the Right Honourable Gentleman not agree that we need to defend the pay scales with an enhanced adjudicator power to secure the viability of this job as an occupation for the future?
I absolutely do, and it's for that reason that actually I felt that a debate specifically focused on the Groceries Code Adjudicator was timely and essential, in fact, because that relationship between the producer and the retailer ultimately is one which is absolutely critical. And, you know, unless we get that right, then yes, there is going to be no future. That the determination of many generations, one after the other, to go into agriculture will simply not be worth it. And you see the reduction of agriculture, you see a change in the countryside, and many of the environmental objectives that we seek to achieve rely on agriculture, and ultimately, at the end of the day, it will be counterproductive to achieving these environmental gains. Now, I understand the reluctance and the caution of governments to interfere effectively in the operation of a market. We all know that when we start that, the law of unintended consequences is never far away. But I would suggest to the Minister and to the House that 10 years down the line from the creation of the Adjudicator, it is now surely obvious that the way in which it is working, measured on the outputs, is simply not good enough, and that reform is required. And the good news for the Government, on the basis of the debate we had here yesterday, is that there is already within this House, from people representing rural seats and urban seats both, a fairly broad consensus about what that reform should actually achieve. Ultimately, the Competition Commission report identified what was essentially a dysfunctional market. On the one hand, you have a handful of behemoth purchasers. 95% of the food consumed in this country comes from 12 retail companies. And on the other hand, you have thousands of small businesses, farming, processing and others. We've all heard the stories over the years about the influence of the supermarkets. If you are a big food manufacturer like Kraft or similar, then yes, of course, you can compete, you can engage with supermarkets on something like an equal footing. But for the farmers and the processors in my constituency and others, it's a very different story. The hard commercial fact is that farmers require access to supermarkets to grow their business. But once they have the once they have access to the supermarkets, then the risk is that they become dependent on it. And at that point, it is the supermarkets who are able to dictate the terms and conditions on which the trade is done. Of course, it's a matter of contract, but every lawyer can tell you that the contract is only as good as the resources behind it when it comes to raising action to enforce it or indeed to arbitrate on the basis of it. So it seems that even 10 years after the creation of the Adjudicator, it's still necessary for farmers and processors to say that supermarkets should be required to buy what they are going to buy, they say they are going to buy, pay the price that they say they are going to pay, and to pay it on time. The fact that we still hear that message, I think, is the simplest case, the simplest basis on which I can illustrate the need for reform. Our farmers find themselves at a moment of a perfect storm. Leaving the European Union brought with it the repatriation of agricultural policy and also a number of trade deals with other countries in other parts of the world. The changes in agricultural support risk reducing the amount of food produced on the land. At the same time, you see land given over to other non-food producing purposes, the creation of renewable energy resources, for example, and the process of growing trees or rewilding or whatever else there is going to be. These trade agreements open up our markets to imported food. That inevitably, if that food is not produced according to the same welfare and environmental standards as we expect our farmers to meet, it will lead to an imbalance in price, and it makes it more difficult for our farmers to compete at price. And at a time when we see massive pressure on family budgets as a consequence of a massive spike in the cost of living, then consumers will buy increasingly on the basis of price. if it seems to me that we're putting ourselves into a place where our own farmers are least able to compete on the thing that the consumers are most likely to buy on. So if the government is sincere in its wish in wanting to keep productive farming in a proper functioning market, and that relationship between the farmer and the retailer is absolutely critical. It is more important than it's ever going to be. I was struck, listening to the debate yesterday, how many of the participants then spoke about farm subsidies and subsidies for farmers. The hard truth of the matter is that these subsidies have never properly been subsidies for farmers. They've been subsidies for consumers, because it has allowed farmers to sell their produce at a price that simply would not, in any free market, be economic. So the people who have benefited from these farm subsidies have ultimately been the consumers and the large corporates, the supermarkets, that have been supplying them. The world is very different today from the one in which the Adjudicator was created 10 years ago. So what are the changes that I would like to see, and around which the consensus to which I referred yesterday has been apparent? The first difficulty in the way the Adjudicator's functions and office is created is that the remit given to them misses out on the early parts of the supply chain. It doesn't cover producers supplying processors or smaller retailers. As with the Groceries Code Adjudicator, the Code of Practice surely requires to extend to include processors, hospitality and manufacturers. As well as the remit that is given to the Adjudicator, the resourcing of that office requires to improve. It's difficult to see how you can possibly hope for an Adjudicator to exercise meaningful control over the big supermarkets, who incidentally are the ones who from a levy fund its operation, if in fact the cost of a single investigation is greater than their annual budget. Remember also that when it comes to that dialogue between the regulator and the supermarkets will not be under-resourced. They have every interest and every means to ensure that they are able to put the most favourable case that they can possibly create. So there is an inequality of arms between supermarkets and farmers, so there is an inequality of arms between supermarkets and the regulator themselves. The code also only applies to direct suppliers, which is now the 14 largest retailers. There is no protection, as things are currently structured, for those who would be indirect suppliers. So any supermarket or other large retailer that wishes to avoid enforcement or becoming under the influence or the attention of the Groceries Code Adjudicator can do that quite simply by purchasing the goods through intermediaries. The Agriculture Act, Mr Deputy Speaker, of 2020 did allow DEFRA to create statutory codes of conduct. There is, I am aware, a consultation by the Government in relation to contractual relationships in food and fresh produce industry, which finished on the 22nd of February. I would expect that that is something that is still being considered by ministers within Government, but I hope it would be possible to hear from the Minister today some indication of when we might see an outcome of that. It does, though, I think, as we consider the reform of the Adjudicator's office, beg one simple question, and it is there an overall strategy at play here? It seems to me now that we have different avenues of influence that are possible, and that as part of the review, The compatibility of these codes of conduct under the 2020 Act and the Office of the Adjudicator is something that requires to be to be examined. Bluntly, I don't really care how we tackle this at the end of the day. The vehicle for change is irrelevant as far as I'm concerned. It's the outcome, the change that we are able to achieve, that matters to me. And finally, the concern that is expressed most frequently to me is one which seems pretty fundamental, and it is that the code does not cover pricing. Few places seem to illustrate that better than the way in which the dairy industry has been affected by supermarket activities in recent years. But when you speak to producers in just about every sector, you get the same story every time. So the strands that you have in government policy at the moment, removing support from production through their new agricultural policy for England, which, as I said yesterday, does have a knock-on effect for agriculture in other parts of the United Kingdom as well, while improving food security, can only both be achieved if British farmers have a fair price for the food that they produce. If we don't achieve that, then removing the direct support for food production from our subsidy system will in fact then mean that we are left with no option but to import ever more of our food. The carbon consequences for the production of that food, reference was made yesterday to it being produced in Central and Southern America and ground that would previously have been rainforest or whatever else. And the carbon consequences then of its transportation would run counterproductive to other stated government policies. So it is in the round, I think, that you see the importance of regulating properly this relationship. And it is now something of a matter of urgency. Research recently has demonstrated that 49% of farmers in the United Kingdom fear they could be out of business next year. 61% identify supply chain unfairness as something that has an adverse effect on their mental health. 23% of dairy farmers doubt that they will continue into 2025. Action needs to be taken. There is a willingness in this House to take meaningful action, to deal properly with this relationship, which in itself will then have a significant effect on the future economic and social viability of our rural communities, producing good quality food for people in all our communities to consume. Who'd not want that?
Kevin Hollinrake.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to serve with you in the chair. This is a debate that's very important to me personally. My father was a farmer, a hill farmer indeed, and clearly my constituency is very much a rural area with many farmers who are experiencing many of the pressures that the Right Honourable Member for Orkney and Shetland refers to. And indeed, he describes it as a perfect storm, many of the pressures on our farming sector right now. So can I congratulate him for today, getting today's debate, but also all the work he does in this area, which I'm only too aware of. He mentions the pressures on business, on farmers in this particular context, and some of the pressures in terms of making a living in the farming community. And indeed, the other matter he raised in a similar context is the competition for land now because of different land uses, which we should be careful with in terms of making sure we have food security as well as energy security and other things we need to make sure we retain in this country. The Right Honourable Member is already familiar, of course, with the Grocery Code Adjudicator, but it might be worthwhile just setting exactly what that is, it is there to do, and indeed how it can help get a fair deal for farmers and what else we're doing to make sure that is the case. The role of the GCA is to enforce the Groceries Supply Code of Practice. It does so by providing advice and guidance to both suppliers and large retailers on matters relating to the code, arbitrating in disputes between large retailers and their direct suppliers, investigating issues to ascertain whether there has been non-compliance with the code, and imposing sanctions and other remedies for breaches of the code. The code applies to the 14 largest grocery retailers in the UK, which have an annual turnover in groceries of £1 billion or more. As he quite rightly points out, the code was put in place following a detailed market investigation by the Competition Commission in 2006 and 2008, which found that direct suppliers of groceries to large supermarkets were faced with unfair risks that adversely affected competition and ultimately consumers. It regulates designated retailers' interaction with their direct suppliers, which includes some, but not the majority, of farmers. While the code prevents the unilateral variation of supply agreements, such as wasted and forecasting errors, and requires retailers to pay invoices on time, it does not cover prices agreed between a retailer and a supplier, which, as he says, are a matter of commercial negotiation. However, the code does help to ensure that negotiations are conducted fairly and transparently, and the GCA has an interest in ensuring that negotiations on cost price pressures do not lead to non-compliance with the code. Of particular note have been the GCA's 7 golden rules, which are all the regulated retailers have signed up to and which safeguard the requirements of the code in discussions about price and cost pressures. There is strong evidence to show that the GCA has been highly effective since it was established in ensuring compliance with the code and changing the behaviour of retailers to ensure fairness for suppliers. Stakeholders have expressed a positive view of the GCA, and their input has helped inform the statutory review of the performance of the GCA that the government conducts every 3 years. Indeed, I met many of those suppliers, and they spoke very clearly about the benefits they see of the GCA. And those suppliers actually represent many of the primary producers that he refers to. The third such review concluded in July 2023, and I hope the honourable members' constituents, right honourable members' constituents, also felt able to submit their views. The review considered publicly available evidence and the responses submitted by 71 stakeholders, including from 27 individual suppliers and their representative bodies, and 30 other trade associations, organisations and individuals. Most of the suppliers who responded to the review said they believe the impact of the GCA on the groceries market had been positive as retailer behaviour had improved. They also said the Adjudicator had addressed the previous imbalance of power and made the grocery market fairer to operate in. For instance, in 2014, just after the GCA was set up, 4 out of 5 direct suppliers responding to the GCA's first annual survey said they had experienced an issue with the code. That is now down to 1 in 3, and the issues that are concerning suppliers are down in practically all cases. Suppliers, including SMEs, feel better protected against any poor behaviours from retailers following best practices put in place by the GCA. In 2022, more than 2/3 of direct suppliers felt that retailers covered by the code conducted relationships fairly. There's an overall consistently high level of awareness among suppliers of the GCA and the code itself. I have met the current adjudicator, Mark White, several times. I've been extremely impressed by his pragmatic approach to ensuring the compliance of the designated supermarkets, which has helped to stop problems from escalating and reducing the need for time-consuming and expensive formal dispute resolution. I'm aware some honourable members have asked whether the GCA has the necessary powers and resources. I know that Mark White believes his current powers provide the necessary tools to enforce the code and change retailer behaviour. He is also responsible for determining the level of resources that he needs and setting the levy of regulated retailers to fund his work. While ministers are responsible for approving the proposed levy, the government has always accepted the adjudicator's levy business case and will, of course, give careful consideration to future requests. Yes, I'm very happy to, of course.
I'm pondering the words that the Minister uses here, because I think he's right. The adjudicator does have the powers to investigate and to enforce the code of practice. But there are still big areas that are not covered by that. And I think that comes to the concern that farmers and producers and processors have.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not ignoring his concerns at all. I recognise that. I did say earlier in my speech, the vast majority of the market in terms of primary producers is not covered by the code. But I will come on to that in a second if I can. I think there are challenges, of course, for a grocery code adjudicator to be the custodian or the overseer of thousands and thousands of business contracts that he'll be aware of, and the complexity and the bureaucracy that might flow from that, which neither of us would wish to see. Certainly the impact on prices would result from that, of course, as well. But I will come on to that if I can. We do recognise that despite the GCA's effectiveness and successful interventionist approach, we have not yet stamped out all unfair practices. The impact of the recent cost-price pressures in the food sector has demonstrated how external factors can affect relationships and behaviours. As such, we recognise the continued need for the GCA's role in ensuring fair treatment of suppliers to supermarkets through enforcement of the code. We are aware there are some poor practices affecting producers across several agricultural sectors which are not covered by the code, and that primary producers, such as farmers, have felt unfairly treated. The government also wants farmers to get a fair price for their products, which is his opening argument and his closing argument, and is committed to tackling contractual unfairness that can exist in the agri-food supply chain. Powers in the Agriculture Act of 2020 enable the introduction of statutory codes of contractual practice to protect farmers. These codes would apply to any businesses purchasing agricultural products directly from farmers, including processors, consolidators and other intermediaries, providing greater certainty for farmers by ensuring that clear terms and conditions are set out in contracts. This will seek to improve the negotiation position of farmers to achieve fairer prices, greater transparency and accountability in the supply chains. DEFRA ministers are exercising the powers in the Agricultural Act in a sector-specific approach, acknowledging that the problems experienced by each sector differ widely and avoiding broad regulation that places burdens on sectors which may not require intervention. The first sector-specific regulations for the dairy sector were laid in draft in February 2024, and regulations for the pig sector are expected to be introduced later this year. Work's also progressing on regulations for the egg sector, and DEFRA carried out a fresh produce review, as he refers to, in December 2023, the response to which will be published shortly. I can't give a more definitive timescale on that, I regret. If it would be all under my gift, perhaps I could, but it's not all under my gift, of course, but he's pretty familiar with that term. Recruitment is underway, crucially, for an agricultural supply chain adjudicator who will be responsible for enforcing the new regulations. As I touched on earlier, it may be that the GCA's very effectiveness is the reason why some consider we should extend its role to ensure the better protection of primary producers in the grocery supply chain, such as farmers. Requiring the GCA to regulate the many thousands of transactions throughout diverse supply chains would risk diluting the adjudicator's tight focus on the 14 largest supermarkets and potentially undermine its record as a highly effective regulator. In terms of what it does, if something's not broken, don't try and fix it. But we understand there are parts of the system that are broken, and that's why we're bringing in the other sector supply chain remedies. It's important instead to safeguard the GCA's ability to remain vigilant on the compliance of the 14 designated retailers. The government, therefore, has no plans to extend its remit, but instead seeks to learn from and emulate the GCA's approach and effectiveness, so this can be replicated for sector-specific codes. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The question is that this House do stand adjourned. Does many of that opinion say aye? Contrary, no? The ayes have it. Order, order.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.